Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here at our second conference. Last year's conference really was the high point of my professional year, and I've already had just kind of a day's worth of conversation already just before the conference started. And I would just prefer to spend the day just learning from everyone else, but my team said I had to do a presentation, so I'm delighted to do that. The theme, as Jim and Barbara have said this year, is promoting professionalism. And I'd like to talk about one aspect of professionalism, which is understanding the wider context that we work in as practitioners. And in particular, I'm going to talk about education policy, how education policy gets made, and the relationship between policy and practice. I'm going to talk a bit about how to influence the policy-making process, and then I'm going to look at a model of how policy gets translated into practice in fact, and how we can use it as a lens to understand different things that are happening. Because I think often if you don't work in education policy, it can seem a bit mysterious, a bit opaque. I spent 16 years working in education policy. I've done that longer than I've been a teacher or been a chief executive. So I've got a little bit to say about this. And I've just realized I should stand right in front of the microphone so you can hear me better. So, that's what I'm going to talk about today, and I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes. I'm afraid that doesn't leave time for Q&A, but I'm here all day, and I'd love to hear your questions over coffee and through the course of the day. So I'm going to start by sharing some pictures of the relationship between policy and practice. And I asked a group of teachers about this recently. I said, if you could draw me a picture, how do you see the relationship between policy and practice? And the first one to respond said, well, the picture in my mind probably looks a bit like this. This? I said, what's going on in this picture? So, well, there's policy, there's practice, they're not really talking to each other. Maybe there's a bit of a relationship breakdown, I don't know. They're certainly ignoring each other, and it's not a very happy picture. There's not much communication going on here. But then the second teacher said, no, that doesn't really reflect my experience. I do try to engage with policy making as a practitioner. I'm trying to talk to the policy process all the time. I think the picture looks a bit more like this. And I said, well, gosh, I used to be one of those policymakers. I certainly never felt like I was doing that, but, that's your truth, so I respect that. That's not a great picture, though. What else do we think? So the next person to give me a picture said, I get that, but I don't actually see it like that. I think there is more attention being paid by policymakers, but I think they get really too easily distracted by the next big thing. I think it's probably a bit more like this. And I said, well, yeah, I've seen that meme before, and it's quite funny. But look, Sue, I can't put that picture up at a conference. This is a sexist trope. I can't be doing this on a platform. And she said, yeah, okay, fair enough. Yeah, I'll fix it for you. But then the last teacher said, look, that's quite funny. It's quite funny. But actually, I don't think the relationship between practice and policy is funny at all. I work in an institution that's had year-on-year cuts because of policy. Lots of my colleagues aren't my colleagues anymore because they've lost their jobs. And those of us who are here are kind of struggling to keep our head above water. My picture is really quite different. It's something like this. And I said, whoa, that's pretty heavy. But I understand your experience. But I think we need to take a step back here because I think we need to understand what policy making is actually all about. And maybe we'll get a different picture. So that's what I want to do. I want to take a big step back and then come back at the end and give you my picture of how I think policy and practice relate to each other. So how does policy get made? Well, it starts off, not surprisingly, with a political agenda. You know, if you're a policymaker, first thing you do is you ask, what do the elected politicians want to happen? And that's right. You know, that we live in a democracy. But that's just the start. You know, you can't make policy just from a political agenda. So what else do you need to take into account? Well, the next thing you need to think about what can be delivered. You know, it's no good having a great idea if you can't actually deliver it in the real world. But there are plenty of things in the overlap between what politicians want and what can be delivered, but they're still not going to work. So the third thing you need to think about what will work. You need to think about what the evidence tells you about what works. And finding the overlap between these three spheres, that's where good policy making starts to happen. And that's what policymakers try to do. So to close in on that a bit more and think about further education, it's a simple picture. I'm going to make it just slightly more complicated because the political circle isn't just one circle. This is something I often talk to colleagues about. Sometimes people see government as monolithic or you know, civil service or Whitehall, whatever you want to call it, as just one big thing. It's not one big thing. There's not just one political priority. There's more than one. So you have to think about what the different bits of government want. So in our case, for example, the two big players, the Department for Education, the DfE, and HMT, Her Majesty's Treasury, the Treasury. And they have two different political sets of objectives. They're overlapping, there's lots of overlap, but they're not the same. You know, if you're a policymaker in DfE, you're interested in educational outcomes. If you're a policymaker in Treasury, you're interested in higher level outcomes. You're interested in public finances. You're interested in national productivity. So there's overlap, but they're not the same. And you need to think about what can be delivered, and you need to think about what actually works. So the overlap can be quite small for making policy. So if we take that as a model, simplified model, I'm then interested in how can you influence that process? How, in particular, can further education policy be influenced? Well, the simplest, the most obvious, the best known way of trying to influence policy making is lobbying. So you're trying to influence one of the bits of the political system by maybe giving some new information, some new facts, making some arguments, basically trying to persuade the political part of the policy-making process to do what you think would be a good thing. But there are other ways to influence the policy-making process too. So one of them is to act on that yellow circle of what can be delivered. So instead of lobbying, you want to demonstrate delivery. You want to show, look, you're interested in what's deliverable. Look at this. We're delivering it. It is deliverable. Or maybe someone else is delivering it. Or maybe it's being delivered in another country. Showing some evidence to demonstrate what can be delivered. That's a way of influencing the policy-making process. And in the same way, you can influence the what works circle. So you can conduct research and share that research. Research into what works. Research into why things work. And in that way, you can give some new information into the policy-making process to try and influence it. And that's all good stuff. That's all part of the process. It's not just something that can be done. It's something that policymakers need to happen, or else they're working in a vacuum. But there are other ways that further education policy can be influenced. So instead of trying to change perceptions or give new information, the other way to influence the process is actually to change the reality. So instead of demonstrating what can be delivered, you actually create something new. You create new delivery capacity. And this is exactly what my organization does. This is what the ETF does. We don't simply showcase what is deliverable. We create new solutions to train teachers, to develop leaders, and so on. We make something new in this circle, and we expand the range of what can be delivered. And similarly with the what works circle, you can design new things that work. You can not just change perception of what works, you can expand the reality of what works by creating new things that work. And this is, in my view, the most effective way of influencing the policy-making process. But I want to come on now and think about how policy turns into practice, because all of that's a little bit theoretical. I want to try and sort of bring it right into everyday practice of teachers, of middle leaders, of senior leaders. So, policy into practice, there are lots of different models that explain this, and I've just got a very simple one here for the sake of time. So here's my simple model. It starts with policy options, and that's what I've just been talking about. So what can be delivered, what works, what takes the political trick, what Treasury will fund, and you use all these options to come up with a decision. And that's the second bit there. And the decision-making process is actually quite simple. Civil servants advise, ministers decide. It's a cliche, but it's true. That's how it works. And then after you have a policy decision, you need to move into implementation. Now, of course, you need to think about implementation when you're making the policy. If you haven't done that, you haven't done it right. But the truth is, implementation comes after policy, and it's not always factored in as well as it should do. So when you come to implement a policy, what levers do you have? What options do you have? Well, I've set out the four main ones. You can use funding, you can use the law, you can use incentives, both positive and negative, and you can create new programs. You can actually do things, boots on the ground, things happening. And of course, it's a cycle. It's not a linear process. So once you've actually implemented some policy, it should feed back into understanding of what works, depending on the evaluation. Did that policy achieve its aims? Was it implemented well? And so on. So taking these four headings just now and just starting to break them down a bit with respect to further education, I think this is broadly how it breaks down. So if you think about how funding can be used to make things happen, basically there are two dimensions. There's how much funding is there, and there's for what. What you're allowed to use it for. What does it get directed for? Law basically breaks down into two. We call it primary legislation and secondary legislation. Primary legislation is just big laws that get passed through Parliament. Secondary legislation, broadly speaking, is regulation, the type of regulation that can be made and changed much more frequently, much more easily, and it's much more detailed. Incentives, well, inspection reports certainly create incentives. League tables in education are used as incentives. And recognition, I've called it fame or infamy. Singling institutions out for what they're doing can be used as an incentive, positive or negative. And then lastly, programs. So actually making things happen. And in the FE world, there aren't that many programs centrally directed. So the FE commissioner intervenes and handles some funding, and the ETF has programs. But when you start thinking about which of those are actually available to policymakers, you start to see a different picture. I mean, until the very recent policy announcement announcing new funding, there's not really been much room to maneuver as a policymaker because the funding hasn't been going up at all. Funding's been going down. So that's not been available as a lever. Primary legislation. Actually, there's very little law that's relevant to further education, adult education skills. When I moved from policy making in schools to policy making in skills, I was amazed. There's great fat tomes of education legislation in schools, but very little that's relevant to FE. And that's not changed in the last few years because Parliament's been so bound up with Brexit. So primary legislation, not a real lever, and actually there's not much regulation in our sector either compared to other bits of the public service, things like health or social care or statutory services that local authorities provide. Not much regulation. League tables just don't really work in FE. The system is too complex, the data are too contested, they don't have any purchase. And actually, there's not really an awful lot of use of recognition either. So the policy-making process for FE actually doesn't have many levers that you can pull. These are the main ones that you're left with. There's detail of what you can use funding for. There's inspection. And then there's programs that actually get created to do things in the world. And if you take a step back from this theory and think about the actual lived experience of people working in FE and training, I think this is right. These are the two things that really drive things from the center. Funding rules, Byzantine, sets of funding rules that are very, very detailed, got to get them right. And the inspection regime, very powerful, and drives a lot of behavior, even when we try not to let it drive behavior. And it's important to take an international view on this as well. Our inspection regime is one of the most intrusive of any country's education systems. Ofsted is not normal in an international context. So probably not telling you anything you don't know. I'm not saying they do a good job or a bad job. I'm just saying they do an unusual job. This is not normal. And in terms of programs, the FE Commissioner programs, interventions, and the ETF programs do fantastic work. But they're a drop in the ocean compared to the size of the funding. We're talking about a few tens of millions of pounds compared to many billions of pounds that go into education. But I want to move on finally in my last section to think of a more practical model about drivers of impact. So I can start focusing in on individual policies and really start to get a sense of how they work from a policymaker's perspective. So when I say drivers of impact, I'm talking about the impact taken as a whole of the whole further education and training system. The economic impact in terms of employability, in terms of productivity, the social impact in terms of social mobility, educational impact, impact on health, impact on mental health, impact on in prisons, helping people turn their lives around. All the different types of fantastically positive impact that the further education system has collectively. As a policymaker, you want to try and maximize that impact, and you need some theory of change. You need some idea for how your policies are going to do that. So I'm going to share one model. It's quite a simple model. I don't claim that it's unique, but it's my model. And I think the impact of the system is affected mainly by four types of things. I think it's affected by the quality of further education. I think it's impacted by the accessibility, by the volume, in other words, how much of it is there, obviously, and finally by the curriculum. What do we choose to teach? And I think these four things together combine to determine how impactful our system is. And you can break them down as well. You could break them down almost ad infinitum, but I'm just going to break them down at one level. I'm going to think about, first of all, what drives volume? What drives the amount of FE? It sounds like a funny thing to say, doesn't it? But the amount of FE that happens in the country. And broadly, it's how much money is there going in, and what's the value for money? How well is that money used? I think these are the two main drivers of volume. I think when you think about accessibility, you want to think about geographical distribution. You want to think about inclusivity. It doesn't matter if it's in your town if it's not inclusive. And you want to think about the virtual dimension. How well is online learning and other aspects of the virtual world used to maximize accessibility? I think when we think about quality, there are three main things for me. There's the quality of teaching, there's the quality of leadership, and there's the quality of, I've called it estate, but really the kit, the tools, the buildings, the settings, and so on. And when we think about curriculum, what makes for a really impactful curriculum? Well, this is hard, this is contested, but I'm going to have a go. I'm going to say, for us, there are four main inputs. I think employer input is vital when you're talking about technical and vocational education. I think learner input is vital when you're talking about young adults, young people and adults. If it's not relevant, if it's not speaking to the learner's needs, then you've not got the curriculum right. I think HE input is really important because a big part of what we do is progression into higher education. And I think the hardest thing to try and nail down is what I've called powerful knowledge. Is the curriculum, is the stuff you are teaching, is it empowering? Is it powerful? Is it superficial and trivial and transient? Or is it deep and important and lasting and foundational? Does it help the learner understand the society they live in, the world they live in? Will it stick with them? Will it empower them? Or will it not? Michael Young's phrase, I didn't invent it, powerful knowledge, I think is a great concept. And I think wrapped around all of these, there's another important thing, which is reputation, because actually we could get all four of these factors really right as a system, but we still wouldn't maximize the impact of further education if we didn't also have the reputation that went with it. So I think reputation matters too. So having laid out a model there, the beauty of it is you can now plug different policies in. You can plug policies into this and see, well, what's the theory of change? What's the idea? How are they supposed to impact on the system? So take T-levels, for example. Why are T-levels going to improve the impact of the FE system, if indeed they are? I think this is broadly how they intend to do it. I think they're trying to improve the curriculum, and I think they're trying to improve the volume. So employer input, very baked into the design of T-levels, as it should be for technical education. And lots more money, because T-levels are going to be a fatter curriculum with more hours, and there's more money from the Treasury coming to make them a more full-time program. So I think those are the two main ways they're trying to impact. Take a different policy. Take apprenticeships. There's been a huge program of apprenticeships reform, still is ongoing. Lots of issues about how well it's been implemented. But what's it trying to do? I think it's actually trying to act in the same way. It's all about, the trailblazers that got employers creating the standards of the curriculum. So it's about employer input, but also it's about the levy, unlocking a whole new stream of funding to create more apprenticeship training. I think that's the theory behind it. Well, what about GCSE resets? One of the other big policies that occupies a lot of time. Where does it stand? Well, I think it's only about one of these things, really. I think it's about powerful knowledge. I think it's about trying to ensure that all our young people have the powerful knowledge they need to succeed in terms of maths and English. In particular, there's a belief that the maths and English that you get in the GCSE curriculum is more representative of that powerful knowledge. Very contestable, but I think that's the theory. I'm going to choose two more. One is institutes of technology. It may not affect many people in this room, but I think institutes of technology, very interesting policy, because I think it hits lots of these factors. I think they think carefully about geographical distribution of these new institutes, don't exist yet. There's lots of new funding for estate, so they're thinking about quality in that dimension. And they're thinking about curriculum, lots of HE input into them, the ones I've seen, lots of employer input. So this is a nice policy, really, on my model, because it's trying to hit three of these four drivers of impact. I think that's well thought through. I would say that stands a good chance of being successful. And, my organization, the ETF, we're just a part of this process too. So if you think of the ETF as a policy, we're trying to act on the quality aspect. We're acting on the quality of teaching. We're acting on the quality of leadership. Now, it's my belief that these are the two most important factors in the whole system. That's why I do what I do, because that's what I believe. That's why I want to do it, because I think this is the bit that makes the biggest difference and matters most. But that's where we are. But there's something else that I think is more impactful than any of the policies I've mentioned so far. Because when you sit in Whitehall, your reach out into the real world, the world of learners, is very distant. And actually, the people that have a much wider effect, I would say, are you, our practitioners, teachers, middle leaders, senior leaders. Because you're in a position to affect almost all of these drivers of impact. I mean, almost all. I don't think you can do much about the overall quantum of funding or about geographical distribution or about estates. But really, all the rest are either wholly or partially within your control. Accessibility, how inclusive your institution is, how inclusive your teaching is, how well you use technology and use the virtual world, the value for money that you get, the quality of your teaching, the quality of leadership in your institution, how you choose your curriculum and how you design it and deliver it, the HE input you get, the employer input you get, the learner input you get. No one else can make that happen. Whether you are teaching powerful knowledge or not, I think these are very heavily influenceable by you as practitioners. So I said at the end I would come back to my picture of the relationship between policy and practice. And this is my picture. So let me explain what's happening in this picture. There's two people in this picture. And one of them is a learner who's been climbing a hill, a mountain, in this beautiful place. I'd like to visit this. And the other one is the teacher, the guide. And they climb together. And the teacher knows where he's going and has been there many times and knows the best route. So there are only two people in my picture. So where's policy? It's meant to be a picture of the relationship between policy and practice. Policy isn't in my picture. Well, it is. It is in my picture. The policy is the weather. Because if the weather is hostile, the climb is difficult. If the visibility is bad, if it's chucking down with rain, if it's slippery underfoot, if it's really cold, it's going to make your climb harder. And you're going to take that into account as the guide, aren't you? And if the weather is good, it's going to make your climb much easier. It's going to make it fantastic. It's going to make it beautiful. But the policy is just the weather in this picture. It's the learner and the teacher who are actually doing the climbing. So my theme about influencing, well, how can you influence the weather? You might think, well, hang on a minute. You were telling us 10 slides ago all these different ways you could influence policy making. So how can I, as a practitioner, influence the weather? Well, I would say the truth is you can't. Unless you're a really exceptional individual, sort of Greta Thunberg type person, you can't influence policy as an individual. But as an organization, you can. So the ETF definitely does try to influence policy. We do try to influence the weather. In fact, this is a phrase that we use around our board. How are we influencing the weather? And as a collective, practitioners can definitely influence the weather. And I think as SET becomes bigger, as it becomes more confident, as it becomes more mature, as it becomes more vocal, then SET too will influence the weather in which you are leading your learners up the mountain. Policy is just the weather. Thank you.